So this is Cassian Humphreys. I'm back on the Bridgetown property, and I'm here to talk about paddock trees or field pasture trees versus forest trees, and the different crown forms that these trees have, and how this information is important to know when it comes to tree retention and management on property, not just in Australia, but around the world. I just want to give a perspective on types of tree. Here we have an example of what we call a forest tree. This is a Marri Gum, Corymbia calophylla, and this tree reached its current crown height and crown spread and size, with an extended trunk when it was surrounded by other trees. It's a remnant of a forest. So here's another example of a forest tree with a high crown, a fairly stressed tree, hasn't made much attempt to start generating a lower crown. Standalone trees like this are a common byproduct of land clearing for development. Whereas this tree is an example of what we would call a tree with a field pasture crown or a paddock crown. And trees which have this type of crown are far better designed for dealing with wind load, for dealing with storm events. And here we have another tree with a classic field pasture crown. The canopy extends from upper to lower, and in many cases you'll find trees like this where the canopy actually touches the ground. And these Marri Gums are very good at developing these long pendulous limbs that literally sweep the ground. I mean, trees with this kind of overall design are exceptional when it comes to damping wind load. So when the way that trees offset wind load on their bodies is they sort of dance. They dance from the outer leaves through the twigs. Limbs oscillate and bounce, and force flow is sort of offset in this kind of a dancing type of pattern. And if you study a tree in a wind event and film it and then speed it up, you can actually see the dance. So next to our forest giant, our forest friend, here we have another paddock tree or tree with a field pasture type crown. This can be seen as an optimal crown form for city trees, for park trees, for backyard trees. To be fair, this forest tree is adapting. You can see how she's growing these pendulous limbs. I think these Marri Gums are actually very, very good at optimizing from a forest tree to a paddock tree. Few species of tree are able to transition from being forest trees into being field pasture trees. This is why Marri Gums get a lot of respect from me. I would suggest that this tree hasn't had sufficient energy reserves to be able to make transition. And then over to this fellow. This is a tree I actually recently worked on. Part of the purpose of this video session is to discuss the work that I did. But here we can see a lot of pendulous canopy which has been extended down. So this tree almost certainly was a forest tree, which has started to make a good adaptation into being a field pasture or paddock tree with that kind of a crown. So this tree features in my latest Arbor Age article, which is just about to be published actually. I want to draw your attention to this limb here. You can see it overhangs a duck shed. Now, as is discussed, and I've got before and after imagery in the article, this tree had a fair extension of canopy over the duck shed, and so I did a bit of an end weight reduction. I didn't take much off. I didn't need to take much off. I mean, one of the great adages of life, as I see it, is less is more. And a limb like this, it's laid down a lot of wood. It's a reasonable distance away from the body of the tree. It needs plenty of canopy to be able to generate the food, the photosynthetes that can keep it energized. I mean, to remove a limb like this, to actually take off a branch like this, it is a massive cost to the tree, because the heartwood becomes oxygenized and a lot of energy resources lost. I can discuss more on this in the future, but coming back to this reduction prune, You know, I probably removed from the end of this branch, I probably removed about 150 kilos at the very tip of the branch. So, you know, I only really reduced it back by a matter of percent, you know, maybe 3%, 2 to 3%. But that is sufficient. You know, looking at the rest of the structure of this branch, that is sufficient to, in essence, reduce elongation and increase taper. And, you know, pruning a branch like that maybe once every 5 years can be sufficient to prevent major limb failure. Because, I mean, we can imagine, you know, like if a limb like this was to fail as one limb, you know, it's a major loss to the tree as well as being a considerable risk. You know, my cuts on this branch would have ranged from about 2.5 centimeters to around about 6 centimeters was the largest diameter cut that I made. The goal with doing reductions on trees is to keep the cuts in the sapwood. We do not want to expose heartwood, we do not want to oxygenize the wood. That sets it up for decay. Okay, admittedly, you know, trees like these Marri Gums, you know, are exceptionally resilient, and with good vitality or health, they will go a long way to sustain their bodies and to compartmentalize decay within. But you know, as a sensitive, you know, professional arboriculturist, I want to keep my imprint small. You know, in the same way that I don't want to compact the soil around trees, I don't want to take too much off them and reduce their longevity. Less is more, and sensitivity is key.
Nurturing nature is foundation to environmental sustainability.
And considering, you know, these adaptable trees, here's an example of a Marri Gum, which is a phoenix. It's a phoenix tree. You know, you can see the large diameter trunk. You know, this was a substantial failure some years ago. You know, it probably was a tall forest tree that had become exposed by forest clearing, and then in a storm event did fail. And then subsequently, you know, the tree has grown, you know, new shoots which have turned into new leaders and limbs. And you know, phoenix trees are actually quite astonishing trees, in that they actually have the ability or capacity to generate sufficient tissue to close over their original fractured body. You know, phoenix trees are a discussion point amongst arboricultural circles around the world, and you know, this tree is an exceptional example. But just having a closer look at our friend here, we can see an active living rope of tissue which is growing around the edge of the snag and going around the back of the tree. I mean, you can, from this side, you know, we're seeing the original outer bark, we're seeing the original body of the tree prior to that failure. And looking further up the top, you know, we can see the a replacement leader, you know, and with sufficient vitality, you know, a tree like this actually will generate sufficient tissue to actually close over a snag. And I've seen a number of tree genuses around the world that can make that kind of recovery, which is, you know, it's an exceptional testament to the resilience of nature and the resilience of trees. I value this tree very highly as well.
Back to the tree that I climbed and pruned over the duck shed.
I mean, to the untrained eye, you wouldn't even know that I've done any work. And, you know, this is the hallmark of a top-end arboriculturist. You know, the average layperson wouldn't know we've done any work. You know, we can reduce limbs quite significantly without taking too much away from a tree, and as well as abating or reducing risk of failure from large diameter failures. And incidentally, you know, the Marri Gums, they are subject to those kinds of failures, less so compared to the jarrah trees which grow in their same forest ecosystems. But as I mentioned, these are phoenix trees. These are exceptionally good at adapting, and so they're really, really good trees for professional arboriculturists to work with. But to be honest, you know, arborists that work on these sorts of trees need to know how to carry out what I call volume reductions. And this is discussed in the article that I'm running in association with this tree, and that I will link to this podcast. In closing on this session, I also wanted to make a bit more acknowledgement to the article that I've written. It's a small piece targeted at homeowners, but I talk about other the categories of tree. We talked about paddock trees or field pasture trees. We've talked about forest trees, and the types of crown that they have. But there are other categories. There's ancient tree. Ancient trees are just very old trees which have progressed to the last third of their lifespan. Then we have veteran trees. Veteran trees are trees which have been damaged by the environment or by their environment. It can be root severance from development site, from building a house pad. It can be a veteran of chronic soil compaction. Also, we've got veteran trees which they can be any age. They can be a young tree which has been snapped in half by a storm event. They can be old trees. Ancient trees can be veterans as well. But there's another term, there's a new term that I've actually created because it fits with the way I'm thinking, it fits with my narrative, and I refer to this new category as the alpha tree. When we look in nature, when we look at human beings, there's always, like, if we consider the warrior from ancient times, there's always a particular human body type, there's a particular type of human being that is the most resilient to dealing with the rigors and stresses of life. And as there is with trees, and I see different species of trees, I see different genuses of trees, I see families which are generically have alpha tendencies, but then I see individuals, and we can even train trees which maybe are a little bit lacking on what they have in the way of DNA or their gene code, but we can actually train trees to be alpha. And the way this is always, everything that I talk about is based on what nature does. So when we look at a tree which has been pruned by the wind, has been suppressed over decades of wind blow, these trees become very squat, and they have these almost like a hedged canopy. And insects and birds do the same thing. They'll take out terminal buds in trees and set up the crowns of trees to be squat, to be dense, to be more resilient to standing up to wind events. A classic example over on the East Coast is the red cedar titmoth, like in a major problem and a pest of mankind's plantations. But in the wild, this organism takes out the terminals of trees and sets red cedars up to be alphas. So alpha tree is a hot topic for me. And in this article that's attached to this podcast, you'll see a bit of a background there. But I'll be talking a whole lot more about this topic and related. I wish you well. Thank you for your time. One other point that I'd like to make is I'm actually quite aware of the fact that I keep saying, It's kind of an Australianism that I've picked up, and I'm not happy about it in my dialogue. This is my 10th podcast. I'm learning how to use this technology. I'm learning how to edit. I'm walking the walk. I'm sure there'll come a time where I'll be sharing perla podcasts, to quote Aussie. All the best.